So Meredith, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Bruce, for that broad ranging talk. And there was a flurry of questions and comments when you mentioned co-housing, which is what I'm going to talk about. So Jeremy asked me to talk specifically about this single project, which is 42 houses that was developed as a co-housing scheme. And a number of you asked what co-housing is. Actually, I'm not sure if I've got control of this, Paul.
Should have. We should be able to take control of it.
Ah, there we go. That's the group that we worked with early on in the design of this scheme. In fact, that's them celebrating just having got planning permission for the scheme that we worked with them on. At the time, it was about 15 households, which grew to 42 over the project. And it's for about a 1 hectare site on the northern side of Cambridge, and the site was owned by Cambridge City Council. In fact, it's part of a much broader, bigger development that was sold off to individual housing companies to build fairly standard estate houses on it. And this one, at the financial crash, was left unsold. So they've been petitioned by local people to assist them in finding space for them to build as a co-housing group. And the City Council were actually not only amenable to that, but they instigated it by giving them some seed funding and gaining funding from central government. So the houses are arranged around a central shared garden, and there's a shared street at the back. There's a block of flats on one side, and the rest of them are all single houses. There was a question about what co-housing is. The best answer actually was given by one of the delegates, which is an intentional community. It's people that come together intending to make a community for themselves. So they're integral in making it happen, coming together and envisaging a place where they all want to live. And typically, common to nearly all co-housing schemes is there is some stuff shared between everyone, and also everyone has their own private space. They nearly all have a central common area that is free of cars children can play in, and all have some form of common house. In other words, a bit of a building that they own in common that they can meet up in. And there's variations on top of that, but oh, this is very slow to react. So that's the, and we're also dealing with a large number of people and designing homes for 42 individuals was a bit of a challenge. They all had different requirements. So partly working on a co-housing scheme is figuring out how you can get individuality within a common consensus. So they all had different needs and requirements. So we had a whole series of different houses that could be also subdivided in different ways. So to give people choice and flexibility, so it was inclusive as possible. It was decided to make the scheme conform to the lifetime homes standards or requirements. So it's all of the houses are adaptable into the future. And there's also a whole series of individual apartments on a single level that are accessed from a common entranceway that are connected to the to the common house. And that's quite critical in terms of the ability for all people to be able to live there long term. There was no discretion about who should belong to this scheme. It's basically they were open to anyone who wanted to conform to the values they hold. They have to do very little other than agree to offer some community work so that the common aspects keep going without excessive service charges. But people can have varying degrees of privacy whilst belonging to essentially a single community. It's also, on one level, very ordinary. Houses that address the street in a fairly ordinary way. It belongs to a wider community as well. The front doors are off the streets and opposite the houses that are not from the co-housing community. They had no desire to shut themselves off or make a gated community. It's very open. But running down the centre of it is what is now called Marmalade Lane. The group chose the name for themselves. That is it has access for fire tenders and so on, but it's essentially a car-free road, which is part of the common space. So anyone can walk through it, although it's in their ownership. But it has a sense of being both public and private. Everyone looks onto it, so it's very clearly belonging to that community. The block of flats is 3 stories high, accessed off decks, which are wide enough for people to be able to sit outside. There's lots actually of flowers up there. They've already had deck parties for one floor, having a party with each other. And that engenders a sense of community. Everyone belonging to or everyone living in the flats will congregate in the various rooms of the common house. And then round the side, on the more private side of the development, is a common garden which is facing south. These photographs were taken fairly soon after they moved in. They've now been in there a year and a half. So it's a lot more productive now. They're growing lots of stuff together. They're establishing a meadow garden where kids play out, and there's some wild original hedgerow that's being left, and they actually spend a huge amount on bird feed. So that's a lot of the community are involved in bird watching. So on the one hand, it's ordinary. We didn't want to make a place that was alienating. It takes a lot from the quality of and scale of the architecture of Cambridge. On the other hand, for some people, it feels very different. We took observations from other communities in Denmark and the Netherlands in terms of their attitude towards privacy and shared space, which is the essential difference, I think, between what comes out of a co-housing community, who have a desire to meet each other rather than to be separate, from ordinary estate housing, where people are very keen to preserve their privacy. So on the left-hand side, there's a road in Copenhagen that was built at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, which was taken over by a bunch of residents in the 1960s. They bought the road off the council and turned it into a space where people have barbecues, kids play out. You can drive cars down there, but it's discouraged. On the right-hand side, there's a new development where this is in the reclaimed Docklands area in Copenhagen. So there are cars, but they're in a semi-submerged underground car park, which means that the streets to the front doors are much narrower. They're about 12 meters apart. So it's quite a narrow street, something that's quite difficult to persuade our planners is a good idea. And it creates an intimacy and a fantastic play space for kids. And that's the street that at Marmalade Lane, where you can see the rear gardens, in fact, to the houses that are facing south, but on the north of the development, give straight on to the shared street, and deliberately have kind of benches at the end of the gardens. So it facilitates the street to be used as a social space, and it's been incredibly successful. We are expecting over the years for the degree of privacy to change, and for some people to want greater privacy in their back garden. And the community does not preclude that. You don't all have to act in the same way. The houses on the south side, which overlook the common garden, again, they give out south facing. They have their own private bit of garden space, or if you're living in one of the smaller upstairs flats, you've got staircases that come down into the garden. Or if you're, oops, I've gone the wrong way. If you're, all of the apartments have a southwest facing balcony that overlook the common ground, and that balcony is a big enough outside space so you can properly use it with a table and chairs. And at the centre of it all is the common house. They've got a particularly generous one. Some co-housing schemes have much smaller spaces. They all have to pay this, so there's 42 houses, so they own 1/42th, if that's the word, of the cost of the development of this building. And it's used, actually it's got a quiet room, a library, a meeting room, what will probably become a kid's room. You've got a creche, you have a kitchen. They also have a shared laundry facilities, a gym and a workshop. So they're incredibly well provided for in terms of communal space. And that's that they have, we're going to discuss in a bit how this is working under COVID, but they were having a meal together every, twice a week. It was originally once a week. It's twice a week. There's no obligation to attend, but lots of people really benefit from that sense of being able to go down and meet people, eat together, cook together. I think one bit that's incredibly successful is the space for kids. As we all know, kids are incredible at making, they're the glue that binds many communities together. If you have a primary school, you're likely to have a shop. You're likely to then form associations between the parents who make things happen. And that's done by excluding the cars from the development. And also shared spaces. So they have shared electric cargo bikes. There's now 2 electric cars that are held in common by a number of families. So it reduces the overall car use from the neighbouring surrounding development, which is, I think, about 1.5 cars per dwelling, to this one, which is about 0.7 cars per dwelling. So, the intergenerational aspect of the development has been very interesting. It's not by design. As I said, this was open to anyone. But what's happened is you have here in this one development a kind of microcosm of what you have anywhere. So you have people from, well, in fact, there were babies that were born during the construction who moved in, and I think the oldest member is about 73. So it's genuinely a development that crosses all age groups. And a sense of, of each person simply contributing what they want to the overall sense of community and how people operate together. So this is Lilac, a co-housing group. A few things that are worth thinking about in relation to this and others, and what could be learnt and taken elsewhere. Gardens are amazing in bringing people together, and this can happen anywhere. I think that outside spaces, the spaces between buildings, make it a really easy and safe way to people to get together when they want to and drift back to their own places when they don't. So pretty much any development can do that. Another one is shared, sharing things. We all have this ridiculous thing where we have our own washing machine, our own power tools, our own lawnmower. The idea that a culture where we think, well, we don't all need that, we're living in close proximity, and why don't we get together and share it, means that people have a practical reason to get together, which produces results in terms of a societal change. And this is happening everywhere. You don't have to design a whole co-housing community and have people fully invested for it to happen. There's plenty of places around the country where people are coming together and taking ownership of bits that they could hold in common or operate in common, which then adds up to a different sense of your neighborhood and where you belong and who you belong there with. This is another co-housing scheme in Copenhagen, but gives an idea of the sense of a park, which is not an open park, but is a park that belongs to quite a lot of people. So it's a kind of semi-public space in that you belong to that park. In the same way that the big London squares are incredibly successful, are places that you are safe places to go to. Oops, what's happened here? This is another scheme that we're working on. This is actually almshouses for the over 50s for a charity, but again, based around a central shared space with individual garden spaces. So you have your own bit of garden to tend, but you can also join in with other activities that are taking place in the garden. As a model, I think it's obviously almshouses, that's typical. As a model, I think it has wide applicability. This is a much bigger scheme we're working on, and we base these U-shaped south-facing blocks so that there's, again, the possibility of shared space and private space. And in fact, there's a co-housing group in Milton Keynes who are now talking to the developers, and we're working with the co-housing group who want to take one of these urban blocks and turn it into their own co-housing community. So it's a kind of simple, applicable way of organizing space that can have social implications. Very briefly, I mean, how does it work? I mean, and what are the barriers to doing it? Cambridge City Council owned the land, and so they facilitated it happening. They brought on a developer. The developer then operated in the same way as any other developer, in that they built it with their own money and then sold it to the individual members of the co-housing group, and ultimately then sold the freehold to Marmalade Lane, or in fact it's Cambridge Co-housing Limited. Why doesn't it happen all the time? There are huge numbers of co-housing groups and community organizations that are looking to do something different, and recognizing that the way in which housing is provided in the country, generally speaking, doesn't promote a good sense of community or of ownership. The main barrier to that is land, or access to funding. It's not that people don't have money, but generally they have equity tied up in their homes. And actually it's the land, as we all know, is the root of everything. So land would have to be laid aside by councils to take it off of the general housing market in order to facilitate this happening. Now this happens elsewhere on the continent, in Berlin, in Zurich, in the Netherlands. It could happen here if there was a will to make it happen. Affordable housing, I mean, we rightly have a requirement for developers to provide affordable housing. That's the current way in which it's provided. That there's a greater degree of difficulty in incorporating affordable housing into co-housing communities, but it's not that it can't happen. We've already spoken to Peabody, and they're very interested in this model and figuring out how they can apply it to their own housing, the affordable housing in their own developments. So the only other thing that I think is worth talking about is you know, how this community has operated within the context of COVID-19. And in some ways, a co-housing development or organization are an intensification of any other community. As I said, they're made up of the people of a demographic that was not dissimilar to other parts of Cambridge, but they've come together and they're all involved in organizing it. So like any other group of people, there are differing opinions as to how to behave in the face of COVID-19. And all of the difficulties or the issues that they have to address need to be dealt with consensus decision making. And when you've got something that polarizes people to a great degree, someone on the question and answer on the chat mentioned about the fear that people still have in COVID. People have very different responses to it. And I think that's really difficult to deal with when you've got a community that is deliberately set up for people to get close together, and you've got a pandemic that is telling people they should stay apart. And the different attitudes to what that means are difficult to negotiate in a community that is so close together. So if there's any questions later, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, well, Meredith, we're going to take questions in a minute. So that was really great. And on behalf of everybody and for Bruce, a big round of applause. We've got quite a few in the Q&A questions for Bruce around technology, from a number around co-housing. But I just want to kick off by saying one of the things that sort of binds you both well is you both talk about different community-led approaches, what I term sort of collaborate. And I'm wondering, you also talk about almshouses and the like. I'm just wondering whether you think this balance that you try to strike between individual and public means that we need to rethink what our homes and communities are.
Yes, that's a good point. And also, you know, our communities are complex things. So our experience with the almshouses is there are people in the area who want to build the almshouses there, and there's other people that would rather they weren't there, who are also part of the community. So, trying to find a balance is incredibly important. And that means also talking to wider neighbours. And that might mean modifying what you think you want to do for your community.
Yeah.
So conversation and communication is really essential.
There's questions about design and there's one on technology, Bruce. I don't know if you've seen that one.
Yeah, so just picking up the point that Meredith was talking about,
Sure.
I don't think co-housing's for everybody, because some people don't want to be part of a community as they age. They want to be living separately and everything else, and sometimes being part of a community in extra care or retirement housing isn't for everybody. So what I'm advocating is a plurality of provision. I think co-housing has a real place and has a real strength in making that connection, that part of something, that shared endeavour and shared ownership. And I think why we're looking at it in a very BME based community in Birmingham is that part of the issue that co-housing challenges is the provider, the landlord, knows best attitude that we come in and impose a view on. And I think we wouldn't have an idea of how that community should be best served and how it should be best run. And so that's why we want to work collaboratively with them. In terms of the technology, I think, going back to the previous session effectively, because that covered a lot of those issues, we're working with Appello. There was a challenge for us to get away from the old analog systems. I, way back, used to rant against the red string and the limitations that provided. Technology now, the digital world and a proper digital system can actually provide so much more. We've got so many issues in terms of older people being the group that's missed the digital elements, the digital potential dividends, and people in social housing are also people who are most affected by this. Bringing that together, because I think the digital divide is getting narrower but deeper. And I think anything we can do to fill that in, give people the access to those arrangements and using it for all sorts of things. So connecting with people, seeing them. We've found people are more collaborative when we put the digital technology in, because they don't have to walk along the corridor, knock on somebody's door saying, do you want to come for a coffee or to meet in the garden or whatever else we're going to do. They can do it digitally. And it's somehow a safer process, and so video has its place, being together has its place. And I also saw a question on the chat while I've got the floor, is really about how we can make sure our communal areas are safe spaces with COVID. We've kept visitors out, so visitors can visit their relatives and their friends, but in their own apartment. The communal areas are for the community, picking up the co-housing principles effectively, and actually saying social distancing, spaces there, but use the communal area. It's part of people's home that they should be able to use and share and come together in safely. And I think that's why we think the communal areas are a key part of the service we offer. So I think, we are learning and adapting our models in the light of COVID, but in the light of resident feedback as well.
Meredith, final word, anything about engaging with residents and perhaps some of the house rules and care offering that people are doing? Any insights around that?
Well, actually, the Marmalade Lane community uses Slack as a method of communication from when they first moved in, and it's been incredibly effective. I think in some ways, I think the digital connectivity is as important as the physical one in terms of feeling like you're part of something without having to make undue effort. And as some people have said in the chat room, there's a degree of separation that some people require, and often within a couple, you might have one that's much more than the other. So I think that's, and the feeling of support that people can quickly put out a message and someone will be there for them has been clearly really, really valued and remains being valued during this COVID time. And that actually, I think there's lots of lessons from what might be quite an extreme version of doing a co-housing community that can be applied elsewhere. I heard a podcast of the guy that started WeWork. Now, this whole story ended really badly, but it began by him living with his sister in an apartment in New York, having moved from Israel, and he grew up on a kibbutz. And he couldn't believe that everyone in this, 10-story apartment building, no one said anything to anyone, no one, everyone got on the lift. And he and his sister set themselves a challenge to see who could make the most friends within a month. And by the time that they'd finished, they were having parties on the roof. Everyone had set up a messaging system, and it became a community. It took one person to say, hang on a minute, it doesn't have to be like this, but someone has to organize it, then it's in place and it happens.
Well, thanks for that, because I think that relates back to what Bruce was saying about kindness and that spark that creates those moments of kindness.